And Tatiana, you can take it away.
Yes, thank you, Sasha. So let me introduce briefly Timothy Nunan. Timothy Nunan is a scholar of international history, Soviet history, and history of modern Middle East. He is currently a lecturer at the Department of Global History at the Free University of Berlin, where he leads a research group on the history of Islamism during the Cold War. Timothy Nunan received his PhD from the University of Oxford in 2013, and his book, Humanitarian Invasion, Global Development in Cold War Afghanistan, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. Welcome, Timothy, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Tatiana. Let me just get my screen up. Okay, let's put it on play. Okay, I think we have that then. Great. Well, again, thanks so much for having me this afternoon. Let me just thank again Sasha Shpetelnik for helping arrange this talk, as well as Tatiana Likoyeva for inviting me to speak at the Jordan Center in digital form this afternoon. Speaking for myself, I've learned a tremendous amount from the YouTube offerings of the Jordan Center's page. And so I consider this an attempt to try to return the balance. So those of you who wonder what the meaning of Islam has been to Russia historically can find a straightforward answer in an unexpected place. Go to the library of the Husseiniye Irshad Religious Institute in Tehran. And there, among shelves of other ideological texts from the early years of the Islamic Republic, you can find a book called Concepts and Terms, Mafahim wa Wajihat. The book, published in 1983, aimed to provide cadre of the regime's Islamic Republic Party with an understanding of key ideological concepts such as Ummah, Imam, unity, jurist, and guardianship. But the first concept that we're explaining in this handbook was Islam. And in that section, the author explained to readers the threat of Russian Islam just after his discussion of American Islam. Against true Islam, the book explained, there exist two kinds of Islam that are, in reality, a mendacious Islam, a distorting Islam, or a deviant Islam. Russian Islam, the book explains, was once considered to be a monotheistic ideology by groups bearing the mistaken thought that Marxism is a scientific ideology in its philosophical and economic dimensions, and that, hence, the laws and prescriptions of Islam conform with these scientific foundations. Hence, Marxism is merely a kind of Islam which has been removed of its faith in God. Now, books like these testify to the ways in which encounters with communism shaped the ideology that erupted onto the world stage in 1979 in the form of the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the anti-Soviet jihad in neighboring Afghanistan. Iranian Islamists criticized the Soviet Union for having emptied internationalism of any meaning through its interventions in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Others attacked Communist Party General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev as, quote, the Imam of atheism, the leader of a Russian imperial state that used communism as an ideological alibi to dominate its borderlands in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Yet, discourses and practices of Islamist anti-communism did not burst into the world of 1979 fully formed. They represented the culmination of some 2 decades worth of attempts to develop an alternative to the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. In my talk today, I want to focus on the period from the Iraqi Revolution in July 1958 to the eve of the Iranian Revolution and the communist coup d'etat in Afghanistan in the spring of 1978. I'm going to focus on how Islamist intellectuals articulated a vision of religious internationalism that could compete with socialist internationalism. And in doing so, I hope to connect with recent scholarship on the role of religion in the Soviet Union and Soviet foreign policy. Works like Aaron Tazar's on Soviet Islam or Victoria Smolkin's on Soviet atheism highlight how religion and anti-religion became vectors for the Soviet Union's relationship with the outside world. Tashkent in the Uzbek SSR regularly hosted international conferences for Islamic scholars, as seen here in the 1980s. Or think about the connections between the Soviet space program and atheism. When interviewed about his 17 orbits of the Earth in 1962, Soviet cosmonaut and second man in space, German Titov, famously said, "I saw neither God nor angels." Yet, if we're going to push this conversation forward, I think it's necessary to invert our perspective and ask not only how the Soviet Union engaged the world, but also how the world engaged the Soviet Union. In this context, how actors outside of the Soviet Union responded to these visions of the Soviet Union as a religious or irreligious superpower. One excellent example of how to do so is the work of the University of Wisconsin historian Juliana Chamidis, who looks at the history of Catholic anti-communism in Europe in the interwar years. Fortunately, new sources allow us to deliver on this vision. In the last several years, beyond engaging Soviet sources in Moscow and collections in the West, I've been able to explore many periodicals produced by Islamist groups throughout the 20th century, as well as a wave of memoirs from Islamic activists. On the left, for example, you can see an issue of Al-Shahid, a magazine produced by an Iraqi group based inside of Iran during the 1980s. And to the right, you can see the memoirs of Muhammad Mahmoud al-Sawaf, one of the founders of the Iraqi Muslim Brotherhood, and somebody who I'll try to center some of today's narrative around. Now, beyond working with printed sources like these, my curiosity to reconstruct a kind of archive of Islamist internationalism has taken me to some unexpected places. In the summer of 2019, for instance, I visited Institute Afghanica, one of the world's largest collections of Afghan opposition materials, located in a small town in Switzerland. There, reading translations of Fidel Castro and Sayyid Qutb into Persian alongside one another underscored to me how the Cold War was often won less between socialism and capitalism than between socialism and Islamism. Finally, my research has led me to engage scholarship and memoirs produced by intellectuals from the Middle East itself. Just to take some Afghan works, for example, activists once involved in Iranian Islamist networks like Mir Aga Haqju have written valuable histories in the 1970s and 1980s that provide us with a view of Islamism and the anti-Soviet Afghan jihad from the inside. And younger intellectuals like Atiq Ervand have compiled the publications of pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese parties in the 1960s and 1970s, allowing us to really get into detail on how Islamists, communists, and Maoists interacted with one another on the campuses of Kabul and in the underground press of Afghanistan. So for me, it's not just about sort of historical completionism as much as about curiosity and empathy that we try to listen to these voices and understand how Afghans, Iranians, Iraqis, and others both engaged with these ideas about leftism and socialism and how they continue to reflect about them today from the vantage point of 2020. So it's with these values and sort of expectations in mind that I want to try to communicate to you some core themes this afternoon. And the first is that the perception of Soviet expansionism had a decisive influence on the development of Islamist ideologies. And yet, as I want to show, these moments when Soviet expansionism or Soviet power seemed to be going up in 1958, in 1971, in 1979, generated a kind of deceptive unity. Consensus over how best to engage Soviet power, how to challenge it, and how to overcome socialist internationalism was often fleeting. Islamists, once united in their response to communism, began to diverge, especially in the 1970s, over whether a state-sponsored pan-Islamism centered around Pakistan or alliances with Palestinian and national liberation movements offered the best vehicle for this vision. By 1978 and 79, the Soviet Union and socialist parties would find themselves struggling to contend with Islamisms from the right and the left, so to speak. Some groups attacking the Soviet Union for its atheism and using Pakistan as a base to do so, others attacking it for its failure to live up to issues of internationalism and social justice. So to try to explore some of these issues, I'll move in three sections. I'll start off by exploring how various Islamist activists in Iraq responded to the Iraqi Revolution of July 14, 1958, which overthrew the Hashemite monarchy and granted the Iraqi Communist Party a privileged position in Baghdad. Next, I'll explore how the Indo-Pakistani War of 1970-1971 and the perception of Soviet involvement therein prompted Sunni actors to double down on their efforts to cement a relationship between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan as the best way to contain Soviet influence in the Middle East. While many Shia actors were relatively uninterested in the fate of Pakistan and began to construct their own networks centered around Palestinians, Afghans, Libya, and other states. And in the third section, I'll explore further divergences between these pan-Islamist networks in the 1970s, highlighting how Islamist internationalists settled on partners from Muammar Gaddafi to the Vatican as it looked for partners against the superpowers. So throughout, I hope to communicate to you an approach with one foot inside of the Iron Curtain and one foot without, grounded in work with Soviet sources, but empathetic to those whose horizons seemed blackened by the threat of communism. So along those lines, our starting point, I think, ought to be the Iraqi Revolution of 1958. The Kingdom of Iraq, pictured here in the Middle East, was ruled by King Faisal of the Hashemite family. Baghdad in the early 1950s enjoyed close ties with the United Kingdom and the United States. In February 1955, Iraq became a founding member of the Baghdad Pact, an anti-Soviet military alliance in the Middle East and South Asia, led by the United Kingdom, with Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan as regional allies. And here you can see, obviously, that all of these countries, with the partial exception of Iraq, directly bordered the Soviet Union or were very close to it. Afghanistan, especially during this time period, was a major recipient of Soviet aid. The Afghan Officer Corps was being trained in the Soviet Union. So while the Baghdad Pact is not intended as an explicitly religious alliance in any way, it happens to border against the Muslim majority regions of the Soviet Union, and in Afghanistan that is seen as tilting towards Moscow, at least during the late 1950s. So this alliance, and within it, Iraq formed one link in a chain of conservative regimes encircling the Soviet Union alongside its southern border. Inside of Iraq, meanwhile, landed elites and Islamic activists looked cautiously towards the Iraqi Communist Party, which advocated for land reform and laws that would guarantee Iraqi women legal rights, such as inheritance rights and the ability to divorce. Yet none of these Islamic groups really called for an Islamic ideology as such, an Islamic political system, or a novel form of international relations. This began to change, however, with the coup d'etat against King Faisal on July 14, 1958. That morning, a group of free officers led by Abdul Karim Qasim, pictured here on the left, assassinated virtually the entire Iraqi royal family, and later the prime minister. The Iraqi Revolution immediately placed Qasim and the free officers before the question of allies, both domestically and internationally. At home, the toppling of the monarchy alienated Iraqi landowners and religious elites from Qasim, while advocates of pan-Arabism wanted Qasim to cede his power to Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt. Opposition from these two groups in Iraqi domestic politics left the Iraqi Communist Party as the only other major political force that had opposed the monarchy but wanted to preserve Iraq's sovereignty. On the plane of international politics, meanwhile, Qasim's coup had taken out the core of the Baghdad Pact, Baghdad obviously the capital of Iraq. And having just overthrown a monarchy, Qasim could expect only hostility from the monarchies in Saudi Arabia and Iran. This left the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent the People's Republic of China, as the only viable major international powers with whom Qasim could ally. So starting in 1958, Qasim allied with the Iraqi communists and began to accept economic aid from Moscow and Beijing. The Iraqi Revolution and its aftermath prompted both young clerical students in the Shia seminary city of Najaf, as well as others, to see a dark future for their homeland. As mentioned before, the Soviet Union was in the region. It had invaded the northern half of Iran during the Second World War. So the idea of Soviet influence and perhaps even Soviet encroachment was not a total fantasy at this time. People in Afghanistan were experiencing similar issues. Afghan Islamists were very concerned about this in the wake of a 1955 aid deal with the Soviet Union in their country. And so as odd as it may seem, actors at this time were really very paranoid and anxious about the expansion of Soviet influence in really the heart of the Shia world. Many of the memoirs and the news sources I've engaged, for instance, like this book on the right, a collection of documents from this one party, describe how the streets of Najaf, this sort of heart of Shiism, were filled with Nasserist and communist protesters, carrying posters and chanting slogans like Arab Union, Soviet friendship, or Federal Union, Soviet friendship with People's China, this at the gates of the Tomb of Ali. And in the words of one activist, it was as if communism, a kind of red wave, had come all the way up to the doorsteps of the tomb of Imam Ali, one of the holiest sites in the world for Shia Muslims. And so it's in this context that young clerics, but also young students, like technical students and university students in Iraq as well, found the first explicitly Islamist party, the Islamic Call Party, in the late 1950s. The date is a bit disputed. So here we have one impetus and one initial response to this perceived Soviet expansionism or perceived Soviet outreach to the third world. Still, it's important to remember that Iraq also had a large Sunni majority and a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. One of the co-founders of the Iraqi Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Mahmoud al-Sawaf, has left behind memoirs that describe the late 1950s in Iraq, and that are really a valuable source. And I've left some of the kind of biographical dates here, but one thing I really just hope to communicate from reading this guy's memoirs is the sense of loss and the sense of terror that he communicates. Asawaf had been born in Mosul, a city in northern Iraq, and he describes in his memoirs about how after returning from Egypt, where he interacted with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, he finds Mosul being taken over by communists. Mosul had been the site of major clashes under Qasim, and he describes seeing people in his home city being beaten and terrorized by bands of the Iraqi Communist Party. He himself is thrown into jail. He eventually has to leave Iraq. And ideologically, the kind of vision that Asawaf had committed himself to and had learned in Egypt is really crumbling all around him. This kind of very conservative, openly hierarchical, openly patriarchal worldview that he has of landowners and stability and kind of a patriarchy is crumbling as Qasim's government is enacting personal status laws that allow women to divorce, that allow them to inherit, to inherit independent of their husbands, and so on. And so for somebody like al-Sawaf, who is trying to reverse the decline of the Muslim world and sees these sort of independent Arab states with large populations and strong armies as a tool to do so, this is a really traumatic experience with him. And so even as I don't really personally sympathize with al-Sawaf, I think it's at least important to try to put ourselves inside of his brain for part of this lecture to kind of follow him as he tries to respond to this trauma of 1958, or as he puts it, a black wave that was tinged with red. So I'll follow al-Sawaf for a bit and see how he responds to this trauma. So in the wake of 1958, while both Shia and Sunni Islamists are thinking about how they can maybe react in terms of domestic politics, they're also looking really far and wide for international allies to combat the threat of Qasim and communism. So Asawaf, for his part, first flees to Syria in 1959, and the first place he turns is to Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt. Asawaf again and again is going to come to this idea of we need a big Muslim state with a big population and a big army if we're ever going to hold back against the Soviet Union, which is, after all, a big state with a big army, if nothing else. And Asawaf writes to Nasser, pleading him to abandon pan-Arabism and take on pan-Islamism as the only force that can unite the Muslim world, that can unite Arabs, Kurds, Turks, Iranians, and others against the menace that he sees afflicting his homeland. And as he writes in a letter to Nasser, the war today is a war of beliefs, and there is no belief like Islam in its durability, its power, its purity, and its integrity. Asawaf proposes to Nasser that he abolish Voice of the Arabs, the famous anti-colonial radio station, and replace it with a new radio program, one, he says, that will broadcast into the distance, be more strong, be more elevated than Voice of the Arabs. Let's call it Voice of Islam. Now, Nasser fails to respond to Asawaf's letter, and ultimately Asawaf will choose to go to Saudi Arabia. There, he finds a welcome patron in Crown Prince Faisal, who was an ardent opponent of communism and was beginning in the early 1960s to establish an infrastructure that could push back against Nasserism and Pan-Arabism in the region. And in the years to come, Asawaf would find employment in the kingdom as a professor and an advisor to Faisal. Once in Saudi Arabia, however, Asawaf begins to look for other places that can embody his vision of what a model Muslim state can be. And in part because Saudi Arabia is relatively small and at this point doesn't have really its own military or substantial military, he instead becomes fixated with Pakistan as the best anchor for this vision of a large state with a large population and a large military. And here's to take one instance of documents in his book. You can see this article that he published shortly following the first Indo-Pakistani War in the summer of 1965. That kind of lays out his geopolitical vision. And again, I want to emphasize that Asawaf is very anti-Semitic, is very patriarchal, so we don't necessarily have to sympathize with the ideological vision here. But I think to situate him as an actor in the Cold War, it's nonetheless interesting. He describes here how it's been 17 years since 1948, 17 years since the disaster, in his view, in Palestine, since the formation of the State of Israel, but also 18 years, 17 or 18 years since the formation of the State of Pakistan. And he's kind of trying to take stock of what this means for the geopolitics of the Muslim world. And he notes in this article, which was syndicated in newspapers around the Arab world, that we as Arabs have totally failed to defeat the people of Israel. We have totally failed in our war against the Jews in Israel. And meanwhile, Pakistan has flourished. It has a robust military. In the early 1960s, Pakistan's army was becoming better equipped. And more importantly, he sees Pakistan as this kind of anchor for Muslim aspirations on the stage of the Cold War. He points to the fact that Pakistan is one of the largest states in the Muslim world, and that with its size at 50 million people, it's one of the best opportunities to push back against larger countries like the Soviet Union and like the United States. It's five times smaller than those countries, the states of the East or the West. But at least from this point of view, from this point in time, Asawaf sees Pakistan as really one of the only hopes for advancing Muslim interests, given the failure, as he sees, of Arab states to do the same. So we have this focus on Saudi Arabia, but also Pakistan as anchors for how to push back against the communist threat. In contrast, however, activists for the Islamic Call Party begin to take a very different view on international relations. In essays published in their primary newspaper, they point to people like Che Guevara as a model, quote unquote, professional revolutionary, and also were very interested in the French Foreign Legion as an example model for how Islamic activism and internationalism could take place. They point to the way that the Foreign Legion was deployed in the war in Algeria, or the army in Katanga in the Congo crisis, as ways in which sort of small shock troops or commandos of international revolutionaries can deploy to regions and push back and fight in conflicts. And this is an idea that they begin to explore in this context. In other words, not building a big state, not building a big army, but rather having a kind of international revolutionary force of sort of small fighters and commandos that can deploy. And yet, as they talk about this vision, it's very interesting that they, as early as the 1960s, are very critical of Saudi Arabia as not only something marginal, but an active hindrance to this vision of Islamic internationalism. They describe Saudi Arabia as a state that is under complete allegiance to Western colonialism, but even worse than countries like, say, Turkey. It's being used to, quote, combat Islamic activism in the name of Islam and the Holy Land, the two cities of Mecca and Medina. In this context. So we can already see a bit of a fracture forming in terms of the proper techniques and scale at which Islamic activism and internationalism should take place in this context. So to wrap up this first section, one ought not to exaggerate the differences too much in this late 1960s moment. It's important to say that both Sunni Muslim brothers like Asawaf and the Islamic Call Party could look to a figure like Sayyid Qutb, the famous Egyptian Islamist, as a point of inspiration. At home in Iraq, Abdul Karim Qasim, the guy who had overthrown the monarchy in 1958, was himself assassinated in 1963. And in the end, neither the Soviet Union nor China perceived Iraq as a focal point for efforts to export communism to the Middle East in the way that seemed, predestined in 1958. And yet, as I'll try to explore in my next section, events a few years later in 1970 and 1971 would prompt a new reckoning with Soviet power and a new search for alliances. Okay, so I'll now move to my second theme, divergences in Islamist internationalism in the early 1970s. Following the Ba'ath Party's coup d'etat in Iraq in 1968, the Islamic Call Party was suppressed and weakened. But throughout this decade, in the late 60s and 70s, new, younger Shia activists from Iraq as well as Iran began to build on its vision of transnational revolution. And pictured here are just some of what I consider the most important members of what we might call Islamic internationalists, or as one Lebanese journalist dubbed them, an internationalist Islamic current, al-Tayar al-Islami al-Umami. So for the moment, I'm going to try to focus, I could have a lot to say about these people, but for most of this talk, I'm going to focus on the man on the top left, Mohammad Montazeri, an Iranian from the city of Esfahan in sort of southern Iran. His father was a very prominent Ayatollah, and we can get into a lot of that in Q&A. But Montazeri, I think, is really important because he, more than any, would become one of the leading faces of Iranian outreach to national liberation movements in the 1970s and the early 1980s. Montazeri became committed to the idea of armed struggle and using violence to advance his political aim. But I think he's quite interesting in that he is trying to envision a world sort of beyond nations. After the Islamic Revolution, he'll talk about how it shouldn't just be Iranians that can be the president of the Islamic Republic, but it should be any Muslim. And he talks a lot about how we're pursuing the same struggle as people in Central America with liberation theology. And we should try to imagine a world in which there are no nations at all. So while his life is ultimately cut short, and while he's certainly not a completely laudable figure, I think he's a really interesting lens through which we can think about how these younger activists are kind of remixing themes of internationalism and visions of the Muslim world in the context of the 1970s. So, but for today's context, I want to focus on Montazeri's activities in the early 1970s. Montazeri had protested the Shah and the Shah's despotism in the 1960s, protested visits of David Rockefeller to Iran, and in 1971, he was forced to flee Iran to avoid further arrest and persecution by the Shah's secret police. His ultimate aim and destination where he wanted to get to was Najaf, the same city in Iraq that I mentioned earlier in the context of the Imam Ali Mosque. But due to border controls and due to other security measures, he would have to take an extremely circuitous route to get there. Montazeri would end up traveling from Mashhad in northeastern Iran to Zahedan, a kind of border town in southeastern Iran, traverse through parts of southern Afghanistan, get to the Pakistani city of Quetta, and would eventually arrive in the Pakistani city of Karachi sometime probably in early 1971, from as far as I can make out. There, Montazeri would make contact with Pakistani clerics who knew the Ayatollah Khomeini, as well as a small Palestinian community, which I'll come back to later. So Montazeri appears to have spent a lot of his time in Karachi without any money and homeless and attempting to practice his English, sleeping in parks and so on, so not a very glamorous life. But it did offer him an opportunity to familiarize himself with the Pakistani Islamist scene and to sort of have a launching point to explore Afghanistan shortly. However, Montazeri arrived in Pakistan during the midst of a regional crisis. Since its founding, Pakistan had consisted of two territories, Bengali majority East Pakistan, 1,000 miles away from West Pakistan. Following years of military dictatorship, Pakistan had elections in December 1970. The Islamist group Jamiat Islami claimed a following in both parts of the country, but it claimed a distant third place in the votes to the East Pakistan-based Awami League and the Pakistan People's Party. When politicians in West Pakistan refused to allow the Awami League to form a government, this triggered a chain of events that led to East Pakistan's declaration of independence from West Pakistan. The West Pakistan Army began massacring civilians in what was now Bangladesh. India, for its part, had long supported the Bangladeshi liberation movement, and when Pakistan launched attacks on India on December 3rd, 1971, New Delhi authorized a ground invasion of Bangladesh, encircled the Pakistani armies, and forced them to surrender. Soon after its independence, Bangladesh also signed long-term aid agreements with both India and the Soviet Union and began to enact socialist reforms on its domestic economy. So this division of Pakistan would immediately become a deep trauma for Muslim brothers like Asawaf, the Sunni Iraqi whom we met earlier. And indeed, a few days before the Indo-Pakistani War was over and the Pakistan army had been encircled inside of East Pakistan, Asawaf wrote a kind of open letter to the people of Pakistan, to the people of Bangladesh, and indeed to the entire Muslim world, which you can see partly excerpted here. And as Asawaf saw it, he says, we Muslims have been surrounded everywhere. We're being oppressed in Cyprus, we're being oppressed in Zanzibar, we're being oppressed in the Philippines, and we are really being just attacked and surrounded everywhere. And he really takes this moment to kind of feel very sorry for himself and lament how Pakistan, which had been supposed to be this project for Muslim ascendancy in the context of the 60s, has really broken down completely. Instead of being the Qurrat al-Ain, or the solace of the eye, this phrase from Muslim tradition, it has really failed completely and has fallen victim to, as he sees it, Indian, communist, and Jewish conspiracies. But he reminds his readers, this is not the end. This is sort of not the worst tragedy that's about to befall us, but there's even worse things to come. And we need to try to find ways to rally around this sort of fragment of what remains of Pakistan. At the end of his letter, Asawaf says, look, I am going to place myself at the personal disposal of the Pakistan military. They can do anything they want with me. I am ready to fight. And I am asking that any Muslim who agrees with me should also place themselves at the disposal of Pakistan. This is a fard ayn, or a kind of individual obligation or individual responsibility that all Muslims have to perform in the way that they would go on Hajj or perform prayer. So in short, Asawaf really sees this as a huge trauma and is really trying to deal with how his vision of Islamist internationalism can survive in this context of what he sees as Soviet, Indian, and superpower connivances. Now, in contrast, Montazeri, the younger Iranian activist whom I just introduced, would see the early 1970s and the Cold War more broadly in a rather different light. And this interpretation, I want to suggest, would have important implications for the kinds of responses that people adopted later. So not long after the conclusion of the 1971 war, Montazeri traveled from Karachi, where he'd been, again, sleeping in the public parks, to Afghanistan, where he took on the alibi of an Iranian English teacher that was on vacation and just wanted to kind of cruise through Afghanistan. But he went there to try to investigate what was up with the Afghan Islamist movement, who themselves had been engaged in a struggle against Marxism and Maoism for the better part of 15 years. And Montazeri, following his travels, wrote a report for the Ayatollah Khomeini on the prospects of Islamism in Afghanistan. I think it's really interesting to show how he himself is looking at the world at the same time as Asawaf, but is drawing very different conclusions about how Muslims can react to the Cold War, to events like the Indo-Pakistani War, etc. There's a lot that I can talk about in the report, but I think just one really interesting part is him writing to Khomeini, saying that it's obvious that the progress of Marxism and its reception was really only successful because there weren't any good competitors to it. There weren't any strong, viable national or religious liberation movements. Hence, he says, Marxism was accepted as the only path to liberation from the wicked conspiracies of Western imperialists and their regional and domestic lackeys, as well as salvation from oppression, poverty, and social disorder. And so he says, in the 1950s and early 1960s, Marxism had this kind of artificial monopoly on claims of social justice, but this really wasn't going to last. And he notes, with the genesis of national and religious revolutions, Marxism's artificial revolutionary monopoly has failed, proving that there exist better and more numerous paths of revolution oriented towards the masses that shall carry us to our destination. So, Montazeri is basically saying, look, the Cold War in the sense that we might have understood it in 1958 doesn't really exist anymore. The Soviet Union doesn't have this monopoly on social justice that it once had. And he notes in the same report, even China is now working with the United States. And he notes that, hey, all these Afghan Maoists are totally confused and don't know what to do with themselves. We should engage them. We should bring them on board onto our cause. So Montazeri is really, I think, thinking through the implications of 1970s geopolitics in a way that is quite interesting and telling in terms of how Maoism can be brought on board, and how the Soviet Union is really more of a paper tiger than it had once seemed. Also interestingly, rather than seeing the Soviet Union or the United States as the greatest problem for the Islamic revival, Montazeri underscores that the most important challenge that followers of Khomeini face is the Muslim Brotherhood. And he writes that the Muslim Brotherhood is led by Sunni clerics who espouse pseudo-Qutbist views. That is to say, these guys claim to be followers of Sayyid Qutb, but they're not. They're fake. And he notes how the Muslim Brotherhood and with it Saudi Arabia have essentially become a reactionary force. And he notes that we really have to focus on competition with these forces. He concludes saying, the Muslim Brotherhood now only regards Islam as an instrument for the exploitation of the region by capitalist and Western powers. So while Montazeri is still only beginning to articulate this sort of way of looking at the world and this vision of international politics, I think you can see how it's quite different from the analysis that Asawaf is offering. Asawaf is thinking about sort of how can we reinforce Pakistan and how can we, double down on this bet of building states and building armies, even if they're in alliance with the United States. And in contrast, Montazeri is beginning to think more about how can we work with disillusioned Maoists? How can we bring on concepts like armed struggle, world revolution, mass politics? We don't want to build cadre parties like the Islamic cult party did in Iraq. We want to build a mass armed combat kind of party, and we need to figure out a way to do that. So broadly, there's this kind of split going on, I would say, in the geopolitical visions between the two men. Obviously, this is just sort of one of many cases that one could look at, but I think that Asawaf and Montazeri are really good examples, given that they would take on very important roles in Saudi and Iranian foreign policy in years to come. So broadly, we have this kind of counterbalance between this analysis of international politics on the one hand, and Asawaf's vision of Pakistan as sort of a fortress Islam against Hinduism, communism, and Zionism. So this is, I think, kind of the split that's beginning to emerge in the early 1970s. So let me move now to my final section, which will focus on the unexpected partnerships of Islamist internationalists in the mid-1970s. Now, today, we might look back to the 1970s as an area of Soviet stagnation, the Brezhnev period, et cetera. But it's worth recalling that contemporaries saw things rather differently. Writers for the Islamic cult party in Iraq noted that the Soviet Union had essentially abandoned its vision of proletarian revolution, in their words. They say that the Soviet Union is no longer looking at proletarian revolution and is instead looking at a revolution of justice over imperialists. They say the Soviet Union is no longer about the working class, it's actually about just oppressed people everywhere in the world. Kind of an analysis similar to recent work by Jeremy Friedman. And in their view, given that the United States had recognized Moscow's interests in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union was seeking to further its interests in the third world. These are not sort of things that are necessarily borne out in retrospect by evidence from Soviet archives, but this is still how contemporaries saw things. On the right, you have, for instance, a timeline of major events that took place around the Red Sea or Central Asia during this period. And at the very end of this period, you can see a famous magazine cover from Time magazine with a kind of Russian bear trying to stalk over new territories in the so-called Arc of Crisis. So even as a lot of this geopolitical vision ascribed to the Soviet Union is not true, actors at the time think that it is. And it's in this context that people like Asawaf and Montazeri would find unexpected partners for their vision of Islamist internationalism. Muslim brothers like Asawaf, for their part, embraced the unlikely partner of the Vatican, the Roman Catholic Church, as a partner in the struggle against communism and to avoid allowing Israel a monopoly on relations with the Holy See. Asawaf and a Syrian colleague facilitated a visit from the head of the Vatican's Secretariat for Non-Christian Affairs to Riyadh in April 1974. And in October of that year, a Saudi delegation traveled to Rome to participate in a seminar on human rights in Islam. Discussions at these events also covered the status of Jerusalem, or the capital of monotheism, as Pope Paul VI called it. The idea of rapprochement between Islamic activists on the one hand and the Roman Catholic Church was not, it bears stating, uncontroversial. Iraqi and Afghan Shia Islamists had long criticized the Vatican's outreach to post-colonial states in Africa and Asia as a form of neocolonialism. And many of them saw Radio Vatican as a threat to the Muslim world. Here we can see kind of interesting parallels between Voice of the Arabs, Radio Vatican, and the idea of making a Voice of Islam radio from Asawaf earlier. And this kind of suspicion of the Vatican would continue well into the 1980s, as you can see from the magazine cover on the right, from an Iraqi magazine produced in the Islamic Republic of Iran about the so-called protocols of the elders of the Vatican and all of the conspiracies and evil doings of Pope John Paul II. Yet, in the context of the 1970s, as advisors to King Faisal saw it, the visit of the Vatican delegation to Saudi Arabia led to the formation of a kind of rapprochement between Muslims and Christians. And the efforts to defeat this visit didn't succeed, even if colonialism didn't rest on doing so. So in this context of the 1970s and this renewed perception of Soviet expansionism, Muslim brothers like Asawaf and his colleagues are kind of changing the terms on how they envision their international alliances. They're formed perhaps a little bit less in terms of cooperation with Pakistan as this ultimate fortress for the fortunes of the Muslim world, and more in terms of a monotheism that can include not only Islam, but also Roman Catholicism as well. This pitted against an enemy of an atheistic Soviet Union. Parallel to this kind of odd couple of Saudi Arabia and the Vatican, activists like Montazeri, the Iranian activist I highlighted earlier, would also begin to find new partners. After his visit to Afghanistan, Montazeri would travel first back to Karachi and then take a boat to Basra, the port in Iraq, and finally make his way to Najaf, completing this very circuitous trip back to the seminary city once threatened by communism. There, Montazeri encouraged others in the Khomeiniist movement to look for patrons and allies in the region beyond just Ba'athist Iraq. Egypt's own retreat from anti-colonial internationalism under Anwar Sadat in the 1970s ruled out Cairo as a patron. And so Montazeri and like-minded Islamist internationalists would have to look extensively around the region for new allies. In doing so, and here there's a bit of oversimplification, but in doing so, I think we can say that they found two patrons in particular. One was Libya, where a group of free officers led by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi had overthrown a pro-Western monarchy in 1969. Boasting immense oil resources and a tiny population, Libya under Gaddafi provided support to an eclectic array of national liberation groups that had been left behind by decolonization. Among those groups that got support from a so-called Fund for the Support of Popular National Struggles were Eritreans who wanted independence from Ethiopia, Moro Muslims who wanted independence from the Philippines, Patani Muslims from southern Thailand who wanted independence from the Thai government, and Western Saharan activists who wanted independence from Morocco. Montazeri and other figures like Jalaluddin Farsi would interact with these groups and begin, I think, to see the Iranian struggle not just in terms of anti-Americanism and a struggle against the Shah, but rather as part of a shared journey of liberation and attempt to create a new system of international relations. Montazeri was seen traveling around the Middle East and going on Hajj with a Libyan passport in the early 1970s, and other activists who went to Tripoli during this period would praise the Libyan experiment in Islamic socialism, in particular Gaddafi's attempts to incorporate Shia jurisprudence into efforts at Islamicizing the Libyan state and economy. By the way, some of these travelers were often very critical of what they saw as too much Soviet influence, especially when it came to women's education and educational reforms in general. So again, they're still trying to navigate between this role of superpowers and what they see as the positive aspects of the Libyan revolution. But parallel to these engagements with Libya, Montazeri ultimately would primarily base himself in Lebanon during the mid-1970s, where he and other Islamist internationalists would forge ties with the Palestinian group Fatah. Fatah had become famous following tactical victories over Israel in 1968, but in 1970, the Jordanian monarchy expelled Palestinian groups, forcing Fatah and others to base themselves in southern Lebanon. Cooperation with Fatah, whose members were largely secular, if not also socialist in orientation, was not an obvious choice necessarily for Shia Islamists. Fatah itself had poor relations with Lebanese Shia, whose land they were sitting on in the early 1970s, and a minuscule percentage of Palestinians were themselves Shia. And finally, the Ayatollah Khomeini had been largely skeptical of armed combat and guerrilla warfare as a revolutionary tactic throughout much of the 1960s and early 1970s. Yet, throughout the mid-1970s, Montazeri developed contacts with Fatah. Members of Fatah were keen to connect their struggle against Israel with those of Iranians and Turks who were fighting against pro-American regimes in the region. And after disappointing interviews with Turkish Maoists who proved to be disconnected from a popular base, Iranian activists like Montazeri committed to developing a mass movement or a breath of fresh air for Palestinian activists. Throughout the mid-1970s, hundreds of Iranian activists would train in Palestinian camps and come to see their struggle as connected with the Palestinian Revolution, alongside those of other national liberation struggles. Just to give one example, one of the people who's close to Montazeri during this period in a speech in Tehran in the late 1970s talks about sort of Iran, Palestine, and Eritrea as all being connected, even though obviously the three revolutions or three projects are perhaps not obviously connected with one another. But I think it's in this context of trying to forge new partnerships that they begin to see their fates as interconnected. So by the mid-1970s, the kinds of international alliances that Islamist actors had formed had diverged further once more. Activists like Montazeri, who sought to capitalize on the popularity of national liberation movements, guerrilla warfare, and the vacuum left behind by Maoism, had no compunction about allying with regimes like Libya and groups like Fatah. Muslim brothers a generation older, like Asawaf, were skeptical of these alliances, however. For instance, in a letter to Muammar Gaddafi, Asawaf had cautioned the Libyan leader about importing foreign ideas and calling them Islamism. Ideology, he says, has to stem from our heritage. It has to stem from our lands and our history, not from red, yellow, and white slogans, a reference to the Soviet Union, People's Republic of China. Yet younger activists like Montazeri had relatively few compunctions about the need to adapt so-called Russian or Chinese concepts of internationalism or armed struggle to the context of Islamism. The fact that Libya and Fatah had increasingly close relations with the Soviet Union by the late 1970s was also not a major issue. Yet, as the Saudi Vatican courtship itself showed, Muslim brothers like Asawaf were themselves not champions of some orthodoxy, but had themselves adapted their partnerships and adapted their form of internationalism to the realities of the 1970s. So let me begin to wrap up and draw a few conclusions. When we think about the history of the Soviet Union's encounter with Islamism, it's natural that we think to 1978 and 1979, when the Afghan Jihad and the Iranian Revolution upended the Middle East and challenged socialist ideas. My talk today ends where most of those conventional stories begin. I've tried to give you a sense of the tripwires that Islamist actors laid out across the Middle East in the late 1950s to the mid-1970s, yet less so as a kind of intentional story of surrounding the Soviet Union and a well thought out plan, and more in terms of these accidental encounters and adaptation to new circumstances. I've highlighted how moments of apparent Soviet expansionism provided the impetus for Muslim brothers like As-Sawaf and Shia actors like the Islamic Cult Party and Montazeri to develop their own forms of internationalism. And if you take anything from today, I hope it's that you see how we can't speak so much of Islamism in the singular as Islamisms in the plural. A plurality generated by encounters with communism and these elective affinities with Pakistan, the Vatican, Libya, and the Palestinian Revolution. Now, granted, the assassination of figures like Montazeri in 1981 and the marginalization of many of the people around him, as well as the eviction of PLO from Lebanon a year later, would dampen the Iranian vision of internationalism. But the ethos that Montazeri and others had brought to the Islamic Revolution would provide, I think, a stamp on many aspects of Iranian foreign policy in the decade to come. And so by 1979 and by 1980, the Soviet Union would find itself outflanked on many fronts by these new forms of Islamist internationalism, ones that had been unimaginable in the context of 1958. On the right, if you will, Muslim brothers like As-Sawaf had found a welcome backer in Saudi Arabia and could finally use the anti-Soviet Afghan Jihad as a means of redeeming the promise that Pakistan had failed to redeem in 1971. On the left, so to speak, transnational Islamist activists like Montazeri had cannibalized much of the Soviet Union's attempt to reach out to the decolonizing world through peaceful coexistence, and China's efforts to do the same through guerrilla warfare, armed struggle, and mass mobilization. And I think it's only by thinking about these dynamics that we can begin to address how and why the Soviet Union's room for action in the Muslim world begins to feel so tight and constrained, especially by 1982 or 83 or so, I would argue. It's by connecting voices from outside of the Soviet experience with more conventional Russian and Eurasian archives, I think, that we can better understand the history of the 20th century. That's the vision of trans-regional and transnational history grounded in listening to voices and trauma and experience from actors like the Islamic Cult Party, like As-Sawaf, and like Montazeri that I've tried to present to you today. So I thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Timothy. It's such a fascinating talk. So we are open now Q&A. Just to remind you, you can use chat box to type your questions. You can also use raise your hand feature or send a message. And I think we have already our first question from Yanni Kotsonis.
Hello, Tatiana, thank you.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. It's a very nice outline and overview of, basically, I think it's a geopolitical approach, right? Which is to say nation states interacting with each other and then crisscross in this case by a new and unexpected movement, transnational, sort of international. So it's interesting in the way that, you know, how we categorize this and how it fits, but it is really this notion of a checkerboard or a chessboard of states and interactions and then forces encountering each other. I wonder always whenever I hear about Islamism and about anything geopolitical, I wonder about the social content or the political content of each of these movements. So when we're talking about this variety of Islamic movements, I wonder if you could say a little more about what Islam means to them. I mean, what the content is, as opposed to who they're encountering, to fill in other words, that space of who they are.
Sure. Yeah, I think that I completely agree on the kind of the way I'm trying to do this, and at least in the context of this talk, how one identifies oneself in the partnerships one forms. But as you say, one comes to those encounters with sort of pre-existing social bases or social experiences. Somebody like As-Sawaf is I think coming from the social milieu of the Muslim Brotherhood. He's representing landowning classes and merchant classes in Iraq that are skeptical of women's emancipation, that are doing well with the agricultural economy in Iraq as it existed prior to the 1950s, and they see themselves as, I think, trying to react to the decline of the Muslim world. They're aware of the fact that the Ottoman Empire is no longer present, and are trying to produce a geopolitical vision that can react to this in a world of nation states. Asawaf is going to be interacting in these networks in Saudi Arabia in exile with other Islamic scholars. There's some stuff I took out, but this is a discussion that's taking place among learned scholars who are still being funded and represented by these commercial backers in the Iraqi context, and later by the Saudi monarchy. But they have the benefit of in exile later not having to respond to a discrete kind of Iraqi social class behind them. People like Montazeri and a lot of the other Islamist internationalists that I look at, I know a bit more about them. They're obviously younger. Many of them interact with people and work closely with people who would become parts of the People's Mujahideen of Iran. One thing that I really haven't focused on so much in this talk is kind of the fluid boundaries between somebody like Montazeri and the People's Mujahideen movement, although those are really quite extensive. They're largely uprooted throughout by the 1970s. A lot of these are guys who may be interacting with Iranian student diasporas abroad in Europe. Montazeri travels a lot to Paris and London in particular, but they're primarily living in exile by the 1970s. And I think it's partly this experience of being uprooted that allows them the space to develop these very expansive geopolitical visions. Part of the talk that I presented today is really about how sort of two communities of exiles, if you will, have the freedom to think about these very broad visions. And in fact, later when they come back to Iran, I think that's one problem that they'll have, that there's not necessarily a large social base inside of Iran for these very expansive visions of social revolution. But you're looking at divergences in generational makeup. You're looking at somebody like Asawaf, who was actually trained as has more clerical education, has more religious education, and is not coming out of this younger student milieu.
Yeah, Yanni, do you have like a following up question, or that's fine?
Just very, very briefly, I mean, for just by way of example, I mean, do they have policies on poverty, for example?
Somebody like Asawaf, at least in the memoirs and his other writings, I don't see him commenting so much on the social question. He is working primarily as a foreign policy advisor to Faisal during this period, and so I think Asawaf at least has the luxury of not working on this so much. Montazeri is very concerned about poverty in the abstract, but it's really more about an internationalist vision of the oppressed. A lot of the memoirs that I have about people interacting with him really emphasize about him, giving charity to people. He's very concerned about the plight of Palestinians in Iraq that he meets. But compared to other actors who become active in the Islamic Republic, people like Behzad Nawawi, I don't see him being as interested in issues of domestic politics. He was, I think, really obsessed with the international, with this kind of ideological plane. And perhaps that's a reason why his vision is less successful than it might be prior to his assassination. There's like a tremendously wide spectrum of Iranian actors. There's many memoirs that I've had the opportunity to work with of people who are ministers of heavy industry and travel to the Soviet Union, who are ministries of housing and travel to the Soviet Union and write memoirs about housing factories and visit mikrorayons and so on. So while the talk I've given today is, as you say, a bit more kind of at the intersection of geopolitics and ideas, you're completely right that there is let's say, a parallel set of encounters, and one that continues after '79, looking to the Soviet Union less so in this context of exhaustion of Marxism-Leninism, overcoming of it by Maoism, and looks more to the Soviet Union as a kind of imperial state, but still one that can be a source of modernization for Iran. The devil's in the details, of course, and after 1979, there's a lot of feuding between actors like Montazeri, who may want to overcome power politics entirely, and those who say, well, look, we need to be able to build buildings that can withstand earthquakes. We need to develop television programming. So let's look to the Soviet Union for how they do it. Let's look to how they manage ethnic diversity and so on. So there is an entire story of like state building that is also in some sense a Russian-Iranian story or a Soviet-Iranian story. My focus for this project is primarily in this realm of internationalism, but on some level, it's obviously connected to that story of parallel state building projects and social policy as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Arash Azizi.
Mm-hmm.
Am I unmuted? Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Nunan. Fascinating talk. My question is, basically about whether you see a change in social aspect of main trends of Islamism, and whether you see this as important in this fight. Because, for instance, when you talk about the rise of Montazeri and other Mujahideen Khalq, People's Mujahideen of Iran that you alluded to, and other Islamists, it seems to be a shift from the anti-communism of the past and of the 58. So in the period of 58, we have Sadr writing the book Our Economy, and a sort of an attempt to formulate an Islamic economics that looks to basically be capitalist, i.e., or at least not in contradiction with capitalism, and a repudiation of communism not just as a foreign idea, but basically as a repudiation of communism as an idea of sort of utopian equality. And it seems to be, and the way I have looked at this or tried to look at this is in the atmosphere of global 60s, when there's challenge against a lot of perceived ideas, it seems to be that the Islamists like Montazeri and them are trying to challenge this and replace this sort of anti-communism with something else, and they're sort of critical of this of Sadr and their generation and their stringent anti-communism, and frankly they're okay, as you said, to ally with the other side in the Cold War a bit. So this seems to be bookended with then after the Iranian Revolution, where these ideas are very, as you pointed yourself, are very quickly quashed. Basically, even before the assassination of Montazeri, well, his own father basically declared him to be mentally ill, and they hold the RGC for a while, but they're marginalized. So yeah, my question is, if you see this social aspect, of anti-communism also related to it, i.e., apart from what one thinks of the Soviet Union, if you see a change in social thinking of the Islamists in this period, and if that can be linked to the question of anti-communism.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rosh, for the question. This has definitely been something on my mind a lot. I do see a lot of shifts from this early, let's say, early Cold War Islamism of roughly maybe 58 to 66 or so, let's say, and then afterwards. So what are some of the big changes and why do they happen? I think that one that I have been coming across in my readings a lot is looking to China as both an alternative model and a threat potentially to these older models of activism. A group that I would have loved to discuss more today, but just had to exclude for reasons of time, is the kind of international Islamic party, the Hezb Malal Islami, a short-lived Islamist group in Iran in the early 1960s or mid-1960s. And they, on the one hand, are very enthusiastic about China and say, hey, what these guys are doing in terms of armed combat is really the future and armed struggle, and we should really consider emulating it. They describe the Soviet Union as objectively non-Marxist by the mid-1960s. And I think parallel to that, they're also becoming skeptical of the idea that you should build a party, a hezb, as your organizational structure. You know, if the Soviet Union is not really cutting it as an anti-imperialist force and we want to overcome communism, why should we borrow from its cadre structures in the first place? Parallel to that, these activists are also very concerned about China's role in Africa. They view it as a danger, one that's going to take over what they view as their kind of rightful property, or a sphere in which the Islamic revival should have influence. So I think part of this is coming through this reception of the Sino-Soviet split, an awareness that we need action, and yet how to do so remains a conundrum. As you know, many attempts to foment rural uprisings or to kind of graft leftist Maoist strategies onto ethnic uprisings in Iran in the 1960s basically totally failed. And still, I think these actors are trying to figure out, okay, how can we borrow stuff from the Chinese approach and graft it onto our needs? I think that's a really big. I think that's a really big part of the story. And you know, I think after 1970 or so, people are looking to Gaddafi with excitement. Iranian groups in particular can look to the experience of Siakal, a leftist uprising, and say, no, it is actually possible to pursue armed combat. And so I think it's kind of in this soup of the reception of those incidents, this sort of leftover engagement with Maoism, and I think Gaddafi as an alternative model within the Arab world, that you get these forces emerging. I mean, obviously, as Professor Katsonis highlights, I think to tell this story completely, you need to fold in question of social bases as well, which helps us understand the post-79 story, which is really the challenge here. But I think some of these factors are at play in this interregnum period between, let's say, in the mid to late 1960s.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question in chat. I think, Timothy, you can see it, right? So Alona Vanova, thank you so very much for the impressive talk. Why did you decide to study this particular period of the history? What is your main methods of studying these periods and topics?
Well, that's a good question. I think that you know, I think like many other scholars of Russian history and Soviet history, I've become interested on the one hand in the Soviet Union's encounters with the world and how people reacted to perceptions of Soviet power. And you know, I think like parallel to this event, there's another event going on at Harriman on Russia and international law, I think with Peter Holquist and Will Smiley, if I'm not mistaken. So I kind of see myself on the one hand as part of a community of scholars that is really interested in trying to bring the Soviet Union into conversation with international history. That was definitely one starting point. And then I think parallel to that, I was really inspired by books like Jeffrey Burns' Mecca of Revolution and Adam Getachu's World Making After Empire that, you know, I think to begin to look at how actors from the Third World and the Global South themselves imagine international order on their own terms. And I felt that we didn't really have that for a lot of Islamist actors. And this project is kind of an attempt to bring those two impulses into conversation with one another. So I think that's kind of how I envision the placement of this work.
Are there any other questions? You can raise your hand. Okay, while we are waiting for questions, I can ask one. I have several. I'm very interested about Maoism and Maoism's ideology and its you know, the stress on the rural areas, on the peasantry. Was it's sort of what Yanni Kotsonis asked as well, was it picked up in the Middle East as well among these people, you know, the attention to the peasantry and to the rural areas, and also relations with the PRC as a state. But my main question is we talked. Your talk was about on the side of the Middle East, but what was the reaction in the Soviet Union? What did they say about these developments? If you can say something briefly.
Sure. Yeah, the subject of Maoism is a great one and a kind of small obsession for now. I would just recommend to people to follow Bill Figueroa, a PhD student at Penn, who has recently completed a very good dissertation about kind of Iranian Chinese links and the reception of Maoist ideology in Iran. There's an entire story out there for people to focus on in terms of Afghanistan, which in some ways is a more obvious country to do a Maoist revolution in, but I'll leave it at that. Yeah, in terms of the Soviet reaction, one interesting thing that I can point to, if I'm still screen sharing, I left this out of the talk just in the interest of time, but in terms of these kind of Saudi and Muslim Brotherhood networks, one thing that's interesting that we can find in Iraqi and archives in the Eastern Bloc is begin to see the KGB picking up on these networks. In the particular text that I've highlighted from this report from 1973, you can see the KGB reporting to the Central Committee about how, look, these people are trying to spread, anti-Russian racism inside of Central Asia. They're, interested in breaking off Central Asia from the Soviet Union entirely. And elsewhere in this report, which I should note, I got from Sergei Rodchenko, elsewhere in this report, they highlight saying like Saudi Arabia is trying to depict the Syrian regime of Hafez al-Assad as a sectarian dictatorship. They also point a lot to the activities of Muslim Brotherhood centers in Germany, in particular in Aachen, the university town, and Munich to a lesser extent. So my focus in this project is really primarily on these kinds of Shia Islamist internationalists. I think there's a real story out there to be told about how unexpected places like these student diasporas in Western Europe become potential nodes of connectivity. On the Shia side, if you will, I think there's less good evidence of how Soviet security institutions and ordinary people in the Soviet Union are reacting to these visions. I think probably the most interesting source I've come across thus far is a memoir by an Azerbaijani man, I think Haj Ali Akram Aliyev, which you can find in Persian. And he describes how his first encounter with Khomeiniism, or Khomeini as a thinker, was still before the revolution in Iran. But in his case, it came through Turkish foreign exchange students who were studying in Baku in the mid-1970s, who had become familiarized in one way or another to Khomeini and were abroad in the Soviet Union. And he began to find this very compelling. He wasn't able to emigrate to Iran as he ultimately did until the 1990s. But in other words, I think one story here is that the Iron Curtain is still pretty tight in terms of a lot of information flow throughout the period that I'm looking at. We do have, I think, rare instances like this KGB report. There's other reports you can find in Iraqi or Bulgarian archives telling you similar things, but at least any evidence that I've found in terms of active outreach to Muslim populations in the Soviet Union, at least on the part of Shia activists, is very limited. There may be something out there in terms of Aachen, Munich, God knows in libraries or archives in Saudi Arabia. But this is sort of a story of people imagining what the Soviet Union is like and projecting on it a certain image, rather than one of kind of active discourse and interaction. After '79, figures like Jalaluddin Farsi, a guy who's really central to the story of Fatah Iranian relations, travels to the Soviet Union, but leaves a very bad impression among his Soviet hosts as being, extremely disparaging toward the Soviet Union, of attacking it constantly as horribly corrupt. And Farsi, following his trip, writes a book called sort of the Society of Seven Levels, sort of Jameye Haftawabe, basically depicting the Soviet Union as a totally corrupt, ideologically exhausted dictatorship that is under the thumb of a fat, corrupt, blood-sucking apparatchik class. So after the revolution, there are a lot of these interactions, and that's something I'm working on at the moment in a separate piece. But obviously, the focus for today's talk was really kind of on these imaginaries of internationalism. Even though they may not necessarily be grounded in actual people-to-people encounters, at least within Eurasia itself.
Yeah, thank you, Timothy. So we have a question in the chat box from Farouk Kuziv. Thank you for the talk. How would you define Islamic internationalism? Unity between nations or indifference towards nationhood?
I think it depends a lot on whom we're talking about. And I would acknowledge a bit of perhaps conceptual hand-waving in the talk, because I think it's so contested or up in the air. I think for somebody like Al-Sawaf, he, even as he in his writings really bemoans the loss of the Ottoman Empire, he recognizes very clearly that this is not coming back, and there were obviously like administrative and financial and military challenges that led to Ottoman decline. And so he is I think, very committed to working within a framework of independent nation states. Even as he criticizes there being 40 or 50 independent Muslim countries, I think he recognizes that they're not necessarily going away. At the same time, though, as I hope that I communicated in this talk, he does double down on specific kinds of Muslim states as anchors for this vision of Muslim nations united, working together. For him, having a country that both has financial resources, a large population, and a large military is non-negotiable for how this vision is going to get fulfilled. You need to have a big military power at the center of an alliance of nations, an alliance of nation states, to forward this vision of Islamist internationalism. In contrast, one reason why I focus a lot on Montazeri is that I think he was one of the most original and most imaginative proponents of a kind of Islamist internationalism that would overcome the nation entirely. In many of his writings and in many of his speeches, in particular after the revolution, he's pretty straightforward about how we want to overcome Iranian nationalism. There's a speech I like a lot where he says, this is not really about the Islamic Republic of Iran, but the Islamic Republic in Iran. This is a kind of non-territorial project that just sort of happened to have taken place in Iran. He's very critical of people that we also might put under the heading of Islamic internationalists, like Mustafa Chamran or the cleric Musa Sadr from Lebanon. He says, look, we really want this to be an international country that we are founding in Iran, and says, if you have Iranian nationality, it shouldn't have any effect on whether you can be the president of this country. It should be possible for a Turk, for a Moroccan, for an Indonesian, for a Moro from the Philippines to be the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, full stop. And elsewhere, he's very interested in religious community as something that can overcome nation states entirely. And he even exhorts readers to say, look, if you're Christian, if you're Jewish, you should try to renounce your nation state. You should not have a country. You should form some kind of internationalism on the base of confessionalism. Now, I think a theme that is emerging in the Q&A is how these people attempt to translate these ambitions to actual institution building and reality. And unfortunately, the story I think is quite similar to the fate of the Comintern or Soviet visions of internationalism, in the late 1920s and 1930s. And here to come back to the question about the purpose of the project, one thing I'm trying to do here is I think recover the diversity of these visions and emphasize, paths not taken or ideological channels, if you will, that were not possible given the geopolitics of the moment. And I think again, highlighting how much of this internationalist thought is, not about theological disputes in the 7th century, but rather about precisely these encounters with Maoism or the invention of monotheism as the basis for a Saudi Catholic alliance.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Thank you so much, Timothy, and for a fantastic talk.
Thanks.
I found so many kind of similar points and arguments with my own work on the Soviet Union and communism, but in East Asia. Yeah, and the vision, the vision of the Soviet Union, the perception of it, and the reaction. And thank you to everyone who came to the talk.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, Tatiana, and thanks for everybody for coming to this event. I really appreciate the feedback and the interest.
Thank you so much, Timothy.
Thanks.